Okay, welcome back once again. We're going to switch gears now and learn about the impact of disruption on the healthcare technology market. Sarah Core from our CalPERS private equity team will lead the discussion. Sarah, would you please get started and introduce your panelists?
Is this on? Hello? Yep, okay. Sarah Core in the private equity group. First of all, I want to thank our panelists for coming here today to speak with the board. We have three panelists here. First, to my left is Professor Andrew Lowe, who's the Charles and Susan Harris Professor of Finance at the MIT Sloan School of Business. One might ask why we have him here to talk about disruptive technologies in healthcare. He has spent a lot of his time in the past few years using financial engineering and other finance techniques to think about how to make investments in drug discovery and as well as financing some of these new technologies. To Andrew's left is Peter Francis, a managing director at Summit Partners. Summit is a growth equity investor, which CalPERS has recently made a commitment to. Peter focuses on healthcare investments and has spent his career investing in healthcare and life sciences. He was recently rated as one of the top 40 under 40 growth investors in the United States. And finally, at the end is Dan Mendelsohn. He's an operating partner at Welsh, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe. CalPERS has been an investor with Welsh Carson for over 20 years. Dan joined Welsh Carson earlier this year. Previous to joining Welsh Carson as an operating partner, he had founded a company that was a leading provider of data-driven consulting services in the healthcare industry, and prior to that, he worked in the Clinton administration, OMB, as an associate director in healthcare. So with that, I'm going to ask a question to all of the panelists, and that is, to kick it off, since it is about disruption in healthcare, how has digitization, it's a hard word to say, impacted healthcare?
Well, so first of all, let me start by thanking Sarah Core and Ben Meng for inviting me to participate in this panel. And as Sarah mentioned, and by way of disclaimer, I'm not a healthcare economist or a biomedical expert by any means, unlike my more distinguished and knowledgeable colleagues here. My background is in finance and specifically applications of finance to investments and other areas. But over the course of the last few years, I've gotten interested in healthcare because of personal reasons, friends and family dealing with cancers of various different types. And through that process of trying to understand what they were going through, I started to learn a lot more about how the healthcare industry operates, and specifically with a focus on drug development. And in that area, digitization has really been absolutely transformational, both on the drug development process, so in particular being able to search through databases of literally millions of chemical compounds to try to find certain properties for developing drugs that will have less side effects and more efficacy, to an area that I've been working on, which is mining clinical trial data to see whether or not you can actually predict whether or not certain clinical trials will succeed or fail. Because if you can actually use these methods, these artificial intelligence techniques, to better predict these outcomes, you can actually reduce the risk and increase the amount of resources that investors are willing to deploy to this area. So in the area of drug discovery and in forecasts of probabilities of technical success, I would say that digitization and big data, machine learning, all of the things that you've been reading about in other industries has been absolutely transformational in healthcare. And ultimately, I think it's going to reduce the costs, increase the number of drugs that get developed, and allow us to be able to do a lot more with the resources that we have.
Is this on? Can you hear me? I'd also like to thank the CalPERS folks for inviting us. It's a broad and vast question. I think I would respond to that in a couple different ways. I think when you look back at healthcare, it's about 10 to 15 years behind most other industries that you'll see in kind of the application of technology broadly across healthcare. You know, if you think about banking industry, or if you think about other consumer technologies, they're typically 10 to 15 years ahead of time. And I think what we're starting to see within healthcare is all of the piping and data has started to become collected. And now when we're at a turning point where that data is able to be understood, warehoused, and analyzed to provide insight and to be able to provide clinical outcomes. And I think you're seeing that across changes in how payers approach all of their members. You're seeing it on how doctors provide care for their members and use data. But I think most importantly, consumers today, healthcare consumers, have more access to data, whether it's online health content, whether it's through apps where they can manage their own healthcare. And again, it's going to be a long-term change across all of healthcare services, across pharma, and across all of payer landscape. But to me, we're at those early innings.
I will complete the trio of thanking Sarah for inviting us out here, and it's a pleasure to be here with Peter and Andrew. I think all of us would say that we are each our more distinguished colleagues, and so we'll kind of start there. I think with respect to the question on disruption and healthcare data, I'll start really by agreeing with what Peter said, which is that we are in the early innings. I think it's tremendously frustrating for anyone running benefits today in the United States that we don't get more value for the money that is spent on healthcare. And that's kind of a fundamental truth, and certainly something that a lot of the investments that we're making at Welsh Carson are focused on trying to address that in one way or the other. When you think about this idea of data in the healthcare system, it's useful, I think, to have a framework. And the framework I'd suggest is that first, there's data. There's all the information about you and about your neighbors and about everybody in the state, and the data exists. And getting those data in a usable format is a serious challenge and difficult for a lot of reasons. I mean, medical science evolves, and it's actually very difficult to characterize a lot of the data to begin with, let alone actually get your hands on it. When I was running OMB Health, we made major multi-billion-dollar investments from the federal side in trying to get more data available for use, and that's something that I think is still in process. Like it is not a complete, you cannot get good, clean data consistently throughout the healthcare system, so that's an issue. So there's data, then there's analytics. So it's basically deriving knowledge from the data so that then you can use that to improve the patient experience. So if you don't have an analytic basis, you use the data to then make conclusions as to how you can actually improve patient health. And there are a whole series of companies that are focused on that. Some of them are doing it well, others are in kind of rudimentary phases. Government tends to outsource a lot of this stuff, so I would say is not maintaining a lot of expertise resident within government around analytics, which I think is a problem, frankly, in the long term. And then the third aspect are interventions. So if you have data and you have analytics, if you don't intervene, it's called an academic paper or a science experiment, you know? And so you have to then use the data and the analytics to structure interventions that are cost-effective for the system. So, you know, a nice example of this is how health plans today are addressing quality improvement in the star ratings. So, for example, you know, the Medicare program right now pays health plans, and in fact, it's a very sizable portion of the payments if they achieve a certain level of quality as measured by the star ratings. And most health plans today use their data, deploy analytics, and then will buy cost-effective interventions to improve the quality. And so that's a place where the federal government has come in and said, we will pay you more to do this. And in fact, it's impossible to run a profitable Medicare Advantage plan without doing well on stars at this point. And so all of the health plans do actually invest in those outcomes.
So we talked earlier about having a lot of data available, but it's not very well centralized, and it's not in a usable format. I think were two of the words that were used. What are some ways that the data can be centralized and used in a more efficient manner?
I think one way that's very easy to conceptualize is integration between payers and providers. So when you think about a lot of the best healthcare systems in the country, some of them are in California. Kaiser has integrated a health plan with all of its provider networks, with all of its hospitals. In those type of scenarios, you know, the provider has a full picture as to the individual's health. And I think one way we're able to better use data is to continue to vertically integrate and have partnerships between the payers on one end and the providers at the local market level. And if you're able to do that, you're able to derive some of these best clinical outcomes that a lot of the best Medicare Advantage companies in the country produce. And so I think it's a tight-knit integration between payers and providers.
I would add a couple of things to that. I agree with what Peter said again, and I'd add a couple of things. First, this Medicare Advantage example, I think, is an important one, because the reason why the plans are focused on it is because if without doing well on the star ratings, you don't have a profitable plan. And I was on the board of Coventry Healthcare, which was a mid-cap managed care company, around the time that star ratings switched from being kind of advisory, you know, in other words, the information was published, to after it was actually in the Affordable Care Act. The federal government switched over and started using these star ratings to pay the plans. And that's when the board started getting information on quality. And that's when all of the health plans put their chief medical officers at risk for improving quality along those lines. And it came along with a whole set of operational things. So I think that the payment systems are very important for directing this transformation. You can't have the transformation and still pay on a per unit basis for healthcare, and that's kind of an important aspect. And then the second thing I'd add to Peter's initial response is that there are two policy areas that are critically important. The first is privacy, and the second is security of information. And there have been breaches. So HIPAA, of course, is a framework that we have that we're working with. There have been breaches of HIPAA that have been prosecuted. I think having a very strong policy regimen around privacy and security is really important, so that individuals have confidence that their personal information will be used to help them and to improve their clinical status, and not be used against them or be used in a detrimental way. So having a very strong penalties around that, I think, is really important for the healthcare system, so that the data integrity can continue to be maintained.
So costs are clearly an issue that we're all concerned about. Gene therapies in specific can be quite expensive. You've done some work around this area and have some ideas about how to make it more cost efficient or more value. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, just by way of background, what's been happening in the biomedical field over the last few years is a series of really transformational breakthroughs in how we think about and treat diseases. And the area that's, I think, gotten a lot of attention recently is these so-called gene therapies. The basic idea behind these therapies is there are a number of diseases that are really due to genetic mutations, typos in your DNA, things like hemophilia or sickle cell anemia. It turns out that scientists have figured out a way to correct those typos by taking the correctly specified DNA, putting it into a virus, and injecting the virus into the patient one time. And with just one injection, these gene therapies can actually cure the disease permanently, or at least as far as we know. We don't know how long they last, since these therapies are new, but the basic idea is that once you fix the typo, the genes keep copying themselves. As long as they don't make more typos, you should be okay. The problem is that a one-time therapy is generally going to be more expensive than being treated every month or every day. And so the question is, can we afford them? Most recently, Novartis received approval for a drug called Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for a rare disease called spinal muscular atrophy. And it's supposed to be a cure for a disease that ultimately will make you crippled and eventually cause death. And so this particular therapy, a one-time injection of this virus, its market price is $2.1 million. Now, it's a rare disease, so for a small healthcare plan, probably the chances that you'll have somebody with SMA is not that high. But for the state of California, which is as populous as it is, you're almost guaranteed a number of patients every year that's going to need this therapy. And so the question is, how are we going to afford it? The $2.1 billion price tag is actually a bargain in the grand scheme of things because you get a lifetime of health. It's a one-time treatment that cures. But the question is, how do you pay for it? And the answer, of course, is how we pay for all the other expensive things that we buy, like homes and cars. We basically need drug mortgages. And so my colleagues and I have been studying this problem and thinking about the financial perspective of how do we create the drug mortgages? Who's going to provide the loans to these particular payers and patients? Does it offer a reasonable rate of return to investors who are offering the loans? And will it actually increase access? And so far, the analysis that we've done shows that it's actually not only feasible, but there's tremendous amounts of capital in the financial system to provide these kinds of drug mortgages.
Dan, do you have a perspective from a policy on that?
I'll say a couple of things. I think that first, to underscore what Andrew said, which is that this isn't one drug that's coming down the pike. This is hundreds that are positioned similarly, and I think that this does raise some very profound societal questions about a number of things. One, can we afford all of this? Which I think, analytically you look at it and to see, the strain on state budgets and the strain on federal budgets and, the fact that half of the babies in this country are born into Medicaid, for example. And, when a drug comes to market, there is no practical upper limit on what the drug company can charge in law. And so that raises, I think, a lot of questions that are being really actively debated right now. And when a drug is in a period of competition, like, for example, the Hep C drugs that emerge from being in a monopolistic position to a place where there's competition, you see the prices come down. It's when the first drug is launched and there really isn't practical competition in the market. That's where a lot of the policy focuses today in Washington. So I don't have personally an answer to this question, but I do think that the federal government is picking up an increasing portion, and state governments are picking up an increasing portion of these costs over time. As a result of the structure of Medicare Part D, as a result of the increase in the number of individuals who are being covered under state Medicaid programs and Medi-Cal, of course, as well. And so there are a number of policy proposals that are being debated right now for arbitration, binding arbitration for when drugs come out, to kind of hold the drug companies accountable to some of these ideas of cost effectiveness. So, Andrew mentioned that this Novartis drug is cost effective at $2.1 million. I've seen that research and I believe it. I think that is true. There are other drugs that are launched where the prices might not be correlated as closely to cost effectiveness, and that's something that you really do need to look at. But I think that there are policy questions not only with respect to how we allow drug companies to price in this country, as well as whether there are upper limits on what a public entity should be paying for those products when they come into the market.
Thanks. Another area that's probably important for CalPERS is how to deal with rural communities. So many of the retirees live in areas that are rural and not very well covered by providers. What are some investment capabilities around improving that?
Yeah, I think, it's one of the biggest challenges broadly across the United States is how to deal with rural healthcare. And if you think about it at a very basic level, what's the challenge within rural healthcare is a logistics challenge. It's how do you get providers, psychiatrists, whatever person that the patient needs to see out to those local markets. And really every business model that relies on pure providers driving around in rural Iowa or rural California to see patients is, typically aren't great business models. It's not a very profitable business. So really the true solutions that we see around rural healthcare that we've seen be effective are really things like telemedicine, where, you have a provider group that can provide different specialties, different primary care, addiction treatment for people in rural areas. And fortunately, the way that technology is developed is that telemedicine is now a commodity. It's Skype, it's a TV. There's all sorts of technologies that can get into a patient's home in a rural area. And I think where most providers, where most forward-looking health plans are headed is using the application of telemedicine into rural settings.
I would add that I think there are a lot of ways that this could be accelerated very productively by you and by government entities and the like. So for example, relaxing some of the network requirements in rural areas to enable plans and providers to be more pervasive, kind of better distributed. So some of the technologies that Peter is referring to, if you have really strong telemedicine, maybe there would be a rationale for relaxing some of the network requirements to enable providers to come in a way that was different from the way we're configured now. I think that there are also issues with capacity in rural areas often where the health system has not really addressed the lack of capacity or the lack of demand, if you will. So there are hospitals that really should be urgent clinics, and we're not, I think, properly configured in many rural areas to really be providing cost-effective care. So there's actually a lot of interest right now within CMS in the demos area in how can you think about different models for how to deploy in rural areas. And my hope is that these models actually enable better use of technology through payment systems that are different from the ones that are in existence right now. And by the way, states can also come in and get demonstrations in Medicaid for these kinds of purposes. So that would be kind of a productive use of energy, I think, to kind of come in and work with the federal government and say, hey, we have this issue in rural areas. We want to make sure that quality care is being provided. How do we think about new models to deploy in those areas?
Dan, as a board member of the Alliance for Health Policy, you have a unique perspective on some of the issues that policymakers and leaders in the healthcare industry are looking at. What are some of the most topical things that you're seeing right now?
All right, I have to back up a little bit because Sarah just, among my many burdens, is a nonprofit board called the Alliance for Health Policy. It's not a burden at all. It's a joy. It's a wonderful board. And the mission of this organization is to foster bipartisan dialogue in Washington around major health policy issues. So it's really the full spectrum of political views. And we work with the full spectrum of members of Congress and their staffs and really work hard to kind of promote dialogue and to advance policy that moves the ball forward from a quality and cost perspective without regard to politics. It's very hard to do in this environment, to be blunt. It's not an environment that is conducive to that, but we work hard at it. And in many cases, I think there is actually good bipartisan discussion. It tends to be below the radar, so there isn't good bipartisan discussion about Medicare for all or, whether there should be arbitration in drug pricing, but there is good bipartisan discussion around quality improvement, incentives for quality care, the rural health issues, surprise medical bills right now is a place where I testified on that issue not long ago, and it was an incredibly civil hearing, and there were people on both sides of the aisle who were kind of engaged in that. So I do think that bipartisan dialogue is possible in this environment. And then the other thing I'll say is that every year a new crop of health policy analyst comes into Washington, and they know absolutely nothing about health policy. And so you end up having to educate them and go in and help them understand. And I think it is a very important function that there are organizations that are ready to do that from a nonpartisan perspective. And that's one of the other functions of the organization that I'm very committed to. So I spent a lot of time up just going through the basics. I teach at Georgetown as well in the business school and have a curriculum about kind of the basics of health policy. And you take that content and you bring it up to the Hill, and hopefully, the educational level goes up and you can have better conversation about some of the more important issues as well.
So earlier when we were talking about the cost of the new drug therapy that's 2.1 for the with the one dose, part of the reason that it's that expensive is the cost of developing the drugs in the first place. And you've done a lot of work around different ways to, one, decrease the risk, and two, decrease the cost of drug discovery. Can you spend a little bit of time talking about the work you've done around there?
Sure. So, as I mentioned before, I'm a financial economist, so I guess that to somebody with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I'm no exception. But I got interested in the financing of drug development really through a personal experience. My mother was dealing with lung cancer, and so she had exhausted the standard of care, and a friend of mine introduced me to a very successful biotech company that was developing some experimental treatments, one of which might have helped her. And so I met with the chief scientific officer, and he brought along his CFO, and I just asked them, what I thought was a really straightforward question. I asked them, does your source of financing have an influence on your scientific agenda of which projects you decide to take into the clinic? And the chief scientific officer shook his head, ironically, looked at his CFO, and turned back to me and said, influence? Our financing drives our scientific agenda. And as an economist, I get it. You have to pay for stuff. But as the son of a dying patient, I was absolutely outraged, because what does stock market volatility, interest rates, and Fed policy have to do with whether you should treat cancer via angiogenesis inhibitors or immunotherapy? Nothing. But it drives their scientific agenda. And that's when I realized that actually finance plays a way bigger role in drug development than it really ought to. And part of the reason is because the business model of drug development has not changed in the last 50 years. And in particular, the risk of drug development is really high. The probability of success for a single anti-cancer drug is about 5%. And so when you think about the low probability of success, the cost of developing an anti-cancer drug, which is about $200 million in out-of-pocket costs, and the time it takes, typically 10 to 15 years of clinical trials, it's no wonder that investors are not as interested in putting money into these really, really risky projects, particularly at the early stages. By the time a drug gets close to approval, phase 3 and later, there's plenty of money. Tens of billions of dollars get traded every day on these kinds of late-stage assets. But the early stages is really where there's a challenge, and it's given a name. They call it the Valley of Death. So that's where finance can play a really unique role in being able to pool multiple shots on goal, to use a hockey or a soccer analogy. Instead of investing in one or two drugs, invest in a large portfolio of drugs, because all you need are one or two successes out of a large number of trials to pay for all of them. And so what that means is that you really need to deploy much, much larger amounts of capital as opposed to the smaller kind of biotech venture capital funds that have traditionally been used to finance these projects. So my research has been to try to figure out exactly how large a scale you need, whether or not the investment returns are really there based upon historical data, and to see whether or not any of these ideas can actually be implemented. And so we've been doing a number of pilot projects, all of which point to the fact that actually this business model of increasing the scale will add quite a lot of value to both investors and patients.
And what is that scale?
Well, so it depends on what you're trying to go after. If you're focusing on something like cancer, you probably need a fund on the order of the size of $10 to $15 billion in order to really move the needle, both in terms of getting returns to investors, as well as being able to develop a few successful therapies. If you're talking about rare diseases, like those gene therapies that I mentioned earlier, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it turns out that actually you only need a few $100 million in order to be able to produce really attractive rates of return. And there was actually a proof of concept that we implemented about 4 years ago. It was a small startup based in California, in San Francisco, called Bridge Bio Capital. It was focused on developing therapies for rare genetic disorders. And out of really a small seed investment, the company in the last 4 years has now grown to where it just did an IPO last month. And the company is currently valued at about $3 billion. But more importantly, this company started with a number of preclinical assets. It now has 21 of these shots on goal. And of these 21 shots on goal, 4 of them are actually in phase 3 clinical trials, which is an extraordinarily short time period and a relatively small amount of money that was deployed in order to get the company to where it is. So the proof of concept seems to be there, and so it depends on what scale you'd like to be able to see. If you're focusing on Alzheimer's, actually you probably need more like $100 billion because of how challenging that particular disease area is.
Thank you. Pete, what are some of the areas that you're finding particularly interesting in investing in the healthcare sector right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same themes we've talked about in this session. The key areas we focus on is aligning incentives, as Dan talked about. So it's looking for health plans or provider networks that are paid for outcomes and integrating health plan payers with doctors to make outcomes better. So I'd say that's the top one. Secondly, we're looking a lot at things like social determinants of health. Basic things like loneliness, basic things like cleanliness, ability to get out of your house, especially for elderly populations, matters more than a lot of other things we can do within the healthcare system. So things around adult daycare or interacting, finding ways for elderly folks to interact, those are all areas we focus on. I think the last couple that we're focused on is just healthcare consumerism. You know, every millennial is very focused on understanding their healthcare by engaging online, engaging through apps, different ways of understanding their own healthcare experience without going into the quote-unquote healthcare system. So, you know, we've invested in a lot of different healthcare consumer assets that kind of play that long-term trend. I think the last one I'd say that is near and dear to my heart is just, you know, behavioral health and addiction is a massive societal issue these days. And the treatment paradigms that exist for opioids, for alcohol abuse, which 20 to 30 million Americans suffer from, just aren't developed as well as they need to be. You know, there's a lot of different ways to treat these services, but they're not on every corner. And that's really where we need to invest in. And there's a lot of good economic and ROI that folks like us can generate out of that area.
And as you're looking towards the consumer and their interest in their own health, does that change the way you think about exits for investments and who the strategic acquirers might actually end up being?
Well, you know, I mean, I think that's a hard question. When we think about consumers, like, for example, we're investors in the largest consumer-focused website in the world. We have 150 million people that go to a website called Healthline.com here in San Francisco. You know, that's paid for by pharma, but that's driven by people sitting at home at night saying, you know, why does my foot hurt? and on trying to understand what their own healthcare experience is. I think over the long term, large health plans, payers, they're going to have to take more of a consumer-driven strategy to be able to survive, because basically they're a utility today, they pay their bills, but to be able to innovate and really have a relationship with a patient and be able to better manage their medical costs, they're going to have that consumer relationship. And so over time, I think that will get developed, and those will be the acquirers of consumer-oriented technologies.
Yeah, I would add, so in the Welsh Carson portfolio, many of the same areas of focus, and I would say that a lot of what we are doing is enabling disruption of various kinds to occur in the healthcare system to improve quality and reduce cost, and that is really thematically what the focus is. It's a very exciting time to be in. I mean, as much dysfunction as there is in the healthcare system right now, are there opportunities for investment in trying to fix them? And so some of the technologies that Peter was discussing, I mean, really the deployment of information technology in various ways, and we don't know exactly what's going to work and what's not going to work. So there are technologies, a lot of technologies that do enable consumers to communicate better with providers, whether it be in the context of telemedicine or algorithms that improve patient compliance with medication, or even allowing healthcare systems to be more efficient through better revenue cycle management and better, kind of operational management. So there really is, I think, a lot of opportunity to bring it back to the idea, Sarah, that you started the panel off on, which is that technology really is massively underdeployed in healthcare right now, and there are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained by investing in those technologies and making sure that they get brought in a way that is practical and makes sense. I'd say a second area is really better alignment of providers and payers, and you don't see this as much in California because you have more integrated systems here, believe it or not, but in many areas of the country, there's this massive divide between the providers and the payers, and there really is a lack of integration, and a lot of the investing that is going on right now is to break that down so that there's kind of better alignment of incentives that goes from the top to the bottom of the healthcare system. And that's something that you see it in different structures. You see it in providers that are trying to take on risk and looking for capital to be better risk takers. You see that in the mergers of organizations that come together to bring together different types of capabilities. So, for example, we made an investment in home care jointly with Humana. And it was a public company that we helped take private, and Humana is now co-owner with us of this company called Kindred Healthcare, which doesn't operate generally in California, but again is a matter of trying to align the incentives in the healthcare system so that a plan would have an equal incentive, or maybe even a better incentive, to use a more cost-effective way to engage with the patient.
I'm going to pause here and see if any of the board members have any questions they'd like to ask before I move on.
Ms. Brown? Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Teresa had asked me before they right in the middle. I forgot. I'm sorry, Teresa. She's keeping the record over here.
So thank you all for coming, and I'm aware that this is a presentation on disruption of healthcare and finance. So I will try to keep my commentary to that, but I just had to, there's two things. Actually, I had a few questions. On the rural healthcare, so this is something we struggle with here, okay? Telemedicine, I think a lot of our insurance carriers already provide telemedicine. Kaiser does. There's no Kaiser up or down in the rural areas in California, but a lot, HealthNet does. Blue Shield, Blue Cross, they all do. I heard the idea of relaxing network rules so people can go to other places. I think we also need some legislation around that because I think our DMHC rules are also restrictive. But I think, and then hospital in rural areas, maybe they should be urgent care clinics, not necessarily hospitals. Better use of the technology. But the problem I think that we have is that it's so costly. So if you end up sick and you go, what's to say that if they turn that hospital in and maybe they don't have the overhead, maybe it will be cheaper, but there's no competition. So they turn that hospital into a little urgent care clinic, they're still charging the same prices, so my state workers have to go to this clinic and they're on a PPO, so they're paying 20% of the cost. So what's the solution to that? Because it's this whole no competition, nobody else is up there, you've got one hospital. So what's your answer to that? And then I have more questions.
That's a hard one. You want me to take it?
Yeah, sure.
Nobody wants to take it, huh?
No. It's a really excellent question, and I don't think anyone on this panel is going to pretend to have a pat answer to it. You need competition in order to have reasonable prices, and so a lot of the federal policy right now that is being kind of contemplated, if you will, is to ensure that there are 3 competitors in any given region, and how do you make that happen? And so, you know, in some of these rural areas, that's really just not feasible. So then, maybe you're looking at more of a regulatory approach, where you know, you go in and you actually own the providers and you own the system, and you know, if you can't have meaningful marketplace competition, you have to entertain the idea of a role for more of a regulatory or owned asset type approach. And so, you know, there is certainly a limit to competition when it comes to areas where there isn't sufficient volume. And the one thing that I'll say is that there are a group of really excellent analysts who are thinking about this really carefully within the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation right now. And again, I think they would also be humble enough to say that they don't have an easy answer to the problem, but maybe if they start moving into rural areas where there is sufficient capacity to have 2, 3 competitors within a given region, that maybe that's a place to start. So they're doing a lot of work right now actually in the state of Vermont where the rural areas are different from other rural areas because they're distributed in such a way where perhaps you can have some competition, and so there's some interesting models there.
So, and that's kind of a lead in to the fact that, so then in Sacramento, we have 4 hospital systems, right? Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most expensive areas in California. Mm-hmm. So there is competition, but
are they competing?
Are they competing or are they colluding? Right. Ooh, I love that word. And then you had mentioned that it would be more of a regulatory. So then do we have to, so San Francisco and Sacramento are those 2 areas where there are hospitals and hospital systems and doctor groups available. So would we need to regulate in that way? And then what do you think about, so I think I've talked to a couple of people here about it. There's Medicare, which is a value-based pricing, right? And a lot of states have adopted that as just their way to pay for stuff, period. Now, we're so large, I don't know if that's applicable, but like North Carolina, and I think Wyoming was one. Does that apply to these situations? How do you guys analyze that?
So my view is that value-based payment is absolutely critical for every activity and should never be neglected, and that as soon as you move into fee-for-service with no quality bonus or some kind of a payment for quality, that you're in difficult territory. And I say that from years of the time that I was at OMB, we were really just beginning to evolve a lot of these payment systems, but you know, you see a very strong effect of these payment systems. The plans and the providers do what you ask them to. And if you ask them to bill a lot of volume and not pay attention to quality, they will do that. And
how do you feel about reference pricing then? Because there's also that component of the Medicare research going on too.
I'm answering kind of a different question right now, which is kind of the role of value-based payment. You know, and I'll get to reference pricing in a second, but I couldn't feel more strongly about the importance of pay for value. And it forces the regulators, though, I'll say a couple of things about it. It forces the regulators to really decide what's important to them. So, like, for example, the star ratings, which I think are the furthest evolved payment system, it's about 30 measures. And there are, so population cholesterol, whether there's routine colonoscopy, a lot of them are really population-based measures. We do not have good measures on cancer care, to kind of bring it back to Andrew's observation, and that's a problem. But I don't think that lets the regulator off the hook for not having a quality-based system. I think we have to continue to push to get better quality measures. Now, yeah, please.
The other interesting thing about what Dan said is he's talking about the Medicare Advantage system, which risk adjusts. If you look at Medicaid broadly or commercial insurance, those risk adjustments, they're on a very small scale. So in the grand scheme of things of getting paid for value, if more commercial health plans, more state Medicaid plans and governments decided to shift more towards a Medicare Advantage type approach of risk scoring, star systems, and all of that, I think it would correct itself in some ways automatically.
Now, on the question of reference pricing, because you asked that question too, I think that there is a time and a place for reference pricing. And to me, it comes when there's a clear failure of the market, either due to some of the factors that you mentioned. I didn't say that word, or or really a kind of a complete lack of competition that's happening because of some other failure of the market. And that's also, the job of the regulator to figure out the times when that needs to happen.
Okay, and then my last question, because I have a ton, but other people want to talk. So the impact of the drug, so for example, I think you were talking about the one drug that was $2.1 million? Wow. So could you, before I ask the question, maybe I missed, how did we get to that price? What was the basis of that? Was that the cost of research? How did we get to that price?
Well, there's a long answer and a short answer. Let me give you the short answer first, which is that there's no restrictions on how drug companies can set the price of that drug, and so they set the price at what they thought the market would bear.
Oh, so it was what the market could bear issue?
What the market could bear, that was what Novartis had come to the conclusion of after having consultations with healthcare analysts like Dan and his colleagues and others, and trying to understand what the value of the drug was that it was providing. So healthcare economists typically have this notion called quality adjusted life year, QALY. And the idea is that if a drug provides you with a year of good quality life, it's worth something. And the estimates range from 50,000 to most recently, I think, 150,000 per quality adjusted life year. So if you have an infant with spinal muscular atrophy, and the infant will die eventually, not for a while. First, he or she will get to puberty and most likely be paralyzed by that point, quadriplegic, and eventually the lungs will stop working and the child will die. If you ask what the quality adjusted life years provided by this drug would be, you would actually end up with a number north of 2.1 million. So the drug company stated that was the price, and we'll see what happens when the drug starts to get marketed. It was just approved a few months ago, so this is still pretty new to the market. So that's the process by which they went in order to determine the price.
Okay, so that's just horrifying, I will say. So if 31 years ago my daughter was born with that issue, I couldn't have been approved for a mortgage for $2.1 million.
No, but your health plan would have paid for it if they agreed to cover that particular...
If they agreed.
If they agreed.
And that's what drives the cost of our health plans up. This is ridiculous. So I don't know whether, I don't know who wants to answer this question, but this is a regulatory issue. And,
Well-
and this cannot go on.
Well, so
because
let-
we can't afford to have these healthcare costs go up because somebody is saying, is actually putting, oh my God, value on a human life?
Yes, yes. You're right. It brings up a whole host of really tricky ethical questions. And as an economist, I'll tell you right now, I'm not qualified to talk about ethics. I'm not any more qualified than anybody else in this room, and probably a lot less qualified than a number of you. But it's tricky because in addition to the economic analysis, there's the ethical analysis. But to get to your point about it's horrifying and we can't afford this, I can understand why you might have that reaction. That was my initial reaction. But the more I thought about it, the more my perspective changed in two different ways. One is that if you had a child with SMA, you'd be pretty happy about this therapy. And yes, it's costly, but 2.1 million spread over, let's just say, imagine we had a single payer healthcare system, and I know we don't, but imagine we did, and we spread it across the 330 million Americans that are alive today, it'd be a few pennies, or maybe less.
For one.
If you took all of the patients that had SMA, it would actually end up being a few pennies per person per year in your premiums. We wouldn't feel it. And in a way, that's sort of what insurance is for. Insurance is to be able to spread the risk over large populations. And with a large enough population, it ends up not actually being a big deal. What ends up being a big deal is when it's not spread properly, and so it unfairly burdens different parts of the population, or if you can't spread it across a large enough population, in which case it just becomes unaffordable. But the fact that we can actually cure this disease, we have to acknowledge that that's an incredible breakthrough. And from a healthcare economist perspective, I can let Dan talk in more formal terms, but you know what the cost of this therapy was before last year?
No, I
The
don't.
cost of it was infinite because it didn't exist. And so now I've just given you a discount from infinity down to 2.1 million. That's a great discount.
So I don't remember the name of the guy that created the vaccine for polio, but he gave it.
Jonas Salk.
Yeah, he gave it away.
Right.
Okay, so this is,
Right.
we've gone from, thinking in terms of values to thinking in terms of dollars. And if we have a single-payer healthcare system, there isn't going to be a company that gets to charge this kind, I'm sure, because there'd have to be
Well,
regulation
so,
on that.
So eventually, I think you have a very important point, which is that there are certain diseases and certain therapies that are just too important to be left to the private sector. And that's where regulation really needs to kick in. And I'll give you an example of this in other industries. Gas and electric companies do not get to charge what the market will bear. Because if they did, we'd be paying $2 million for air conditioning during the summer and $2 million for heat during the winter. But they don't get to do that. And the reason they don't get to do that is because a long time ago we decided as a society that everybody needs air conditioning, everybody needs heat. And so we don't allow them to charge what the market will bear. We allow them to charge what we as a society agree is a reasonable amount, and we determine that with all of the relevant stakeholders at the table, namely through a legislative process.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are certain diseases and certain drugs that ultimately we're going to have to treat that way. But until we decide as a society that we treat all disease that way, the market is going to make these kinds of pricing decisions, and we're going to have to react accordingly.
Okay.
I want to make sure
Stop
that
there.
Andrew isn't the sole person talking about the health system dynamics here. So there are two things I'd add to this. One is that this idea of assessing the cost effectiveness of a medical therapy before it is launched, I think, is very important. And in most countries outside of the U.S., the regulatory authorities actually require the pharmaceutical manufacturers to do disclosures and to estimate the health economics associated with a drug and to file that with the regulatory submission. And I think that makes a lot of good sense so that there can be a discussion about what the price is. Put differently, as difficult as it is to grapple with the idea of a drug that is cost effective at $2.1 million, there are other drugs that are launched at $100,000 or $200,000 that are not cost effective at that level, or they're not really adding a lot of value over existing therapies. Maybe it's like a slightly less painful injection, but the drug costs 3 times as much. And you want to know that, and you want that to be systematized, and there are some proposals there. And then to your point about the regulation here, and I mentioned this before, there's a really active discussion that I don't think has a right or wrong answer personally, about regulating launch prices associated with drugs coming into Medicare Part D. And in particular, the federal government picks up the cost of a lot of these drugs, and many of the legislators, and I testified in front of Senate Help on this issue about 1.5 years ago, and many of the legislators, agree with your opinion, and that's why they want to see some notion of arbitration or binding arbitration associated with the cost of these drugs. But in order to do that, you need a basis on which to have a discussion, and that's where some idea of the cost effectiveness of the products becomes very important.
Okay.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
That's a very important point that Dan made, and the fact that there should be a legislative process for making these decisions, I think all economists agree on. But here's where the problem lies. It's that in many cases, ultimately the decision to either allow certain pricing to occur or not actually has life and death consequences for different patients. And so effectively, what you end up getting is a discussion among legislators that is often known as a death panel. And as soon as you use that phrase, this issue just disappears. Nobody wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But ultimately, what other countries have is they do have what we now call death panels. They have people who make decisions about whether or not certain drugs are cost effective, and if they're not, they don't get covered. But that's the kind of moral decision making that ultimately we need to make as a society in order to deal with these issues.
Okay, yeah, Ms. Brown?
Well, this is very interesting. I just did the calculation of my Novartis cancer-saving drug, and if I actually live 30 years on imatinib, it'll cost $3.6 million just for the medication, not for all the blood screenings and all the tests that I go through. So, Teresa, I don't know if you heard that. My drug costs $3.6 million if I live to 79, which Scott tells me I won't, so I might save some money. He's our actuary, by the way. Okay. But it is interesting because that imatinib is a Novartis medication as well. And I do agree that we do need to try to come up with some regulatory approach to how these prices are set. Because when it first came out, the retail price was just a little shy of $3,000 a month for a 30 dose pack. And Novartis gave as their rationale for that, there's not a lot of survivors. It's a very limited amount of people who have CML, Philadelphia chromosome positive. And so that's why we need to charge this much money. But as 85% of the patients started to survive, they had more and more survivors. And so you would think the price would go down. But instead, Novartis kept boosting that price up and up and up. And up until Sun Pharma came out with the generic, it was $15,000 a month. And how does this happen? And that's what my insurance, my PPO plan was paying. My school district was paying for my drug, $15,000 a month with retail price. I don't know what they paid. My copay was $35. And so I do think, and this is just one instance where you would die. I mean, and if you didn't take the drug, you get a bone marrow transplant or you die. So those are your choices. So again, I think $2.1 million is a deal, and so I think we should do it. So there you go. But I do see this again as another clear failure of the market, whether it being with competition for hospitals in rural areas or worse, competition in urban areas where they don't really compete. And so I don't know how we solve that, but I hope I hope we get to that. I don't know if any of you have any comments on that, but that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Law, I appreciate you explaining. Oh, one more, Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller?
I have kind of two things. The first one is, and I really appreciated Teresa mentioning Jonas Salk. I'm a Pitt alumni. I worked for a fellow named Starzl there, and it kind of struck me when you mentioned gene therapy. I also worked for Dr. Evans, Christopher Evans, who was one of the real pioneers in gene therapy, and subsequently went to work at Harvard, and I think he's over at Mayo in Cleveland now. But at that time, all that work, whether it be liver transplants and cyclosporin with Starzl or Dr. Evans' work in orthopedic applications for stem cells, it was all funded by the VA. And to this day, the VA is still clinically on the cutting edge of a lot of things that the private healthcare won't adopt because they're uncomfortable to them for various reasons. But it seems like we've abandoned, as a society, the funding for basic research, the fundamental research. If you can't see an instant path to monetizing it, you can't see that what's going to come out of this might be a light bulb that you can make money with, there's no funding for it. And so, as you say, the funding drives the priorities for the researchers, and it's just luck that cyclosporin also grew hair, or you know, they'd have never come up with minoxidil and made a ton of money, and who knows what might have happened. The same thing with river blindness. We wouldn't be fixing river blindness if we weren't able to cure heartworm with the same medicine in all of our spoiled pups. So that's more commentary on kind of the skewed way that we value basic research and fail to fund it in society, which seems to be kind of a root cause thing to me. The question I had, though, was more as a long-term investor, where do you see the real opportunities in terms of, I think of things like kind of this confluence of AI and three-dimensional imaging and real-time surgical collaboration and telemedicine, or some of the kinds of things where we're seeing even with consumer products, with Fitbit and stuff, where you've got kind of real-time biometrics being used more for clinical, more sophisticated applications, both in institutions and elsewhere. And do you think those are the kind of things that might offer opportunities for us, and how would we find those? Because every once in a while you'll see a company like CarePredict pop up here or there, but how would we go about engaging and coming up with those kind of opportunities?
So these are exactly the kinds of opportunities that we are looking for at Welsh Carson, and that Peter is looking for in his firm as well. And when they present themselves, we have to also be very careful that the investment is actually going to work and is feasible over a time frame that is going to yield a return to you. And so there are different elements of it. I think a lot of what is in the IT space is very attractive. We don't do as much on the kind of the guided imaging. There are other firms that will specialize in places where there's more advanced science, and sometimes we'll work collaboratively with a firm like NEA, for example. But there are places where there's kind of a higher concentration of scientific expertise. A lot of the innovation does come out of universities and does come out of university researchers. A lot of the innovation is originally, like the basic science, is originally funded by the NIH. The NIH is funding $35 billion plus of basic scientific research, even today, a year. And so, there's actually kind of some interesting questions about out-licensing and how much of the value the federal government takes versus the researchers versus the people who come in to commercialize the technology after it. And these are all different variables that we deal with as investors. And again, you can kind of look at it and say, wow, it's really important that the federal government be really actively engaged in this. But if the federal government takes too much of the value through out-licensing, the technology will never get commercialized. And so that's kind of another one of these balance points that you hope to hit it right. But a lot of the types of technologies are really the very ones that we're looking for in the investment portfolios that CalPERS has entrusted funds into.
Yeah, and similarly at Summit Partners, we're a later stage investor. So a lot of the ideas that you're talking about, earlier stage technology ideas, we don't touch those type of companies just because it's a longer stage process to build them. However, I think you can see some very basic areas where things like AI, big data are going to come into healthcare. I think areas like you could envision 5 to 10 years from now radiology where you're doing a read on a very specific film that could probably get done better by a computer with a backup of a human being than having a human being sitting in their basement at home doing that read themselves. So there's a lot of things like that where there's applications of AI and big data that I think you'll start to see over many years here. I'll make one more comment. I think companies like Apple that touch so many lives and your interaction with your phone, I think will start to play a much bigger role in health. They haven't touched it to date. I think they're some of the largest companies in the world, and I think the impact that they will have over 15 to 20 years will be massive in health. I just think they're very early on there today.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to this question as well, because I think you brought up a really key point about, first, how fast the industry is changing and the importance of disruptive technology like AI. And I want to just bring us back to the example that Ms. Brown mentioned with regard to imatinib. So imatinib was a really interesting drug. It was the first drug that was part of the new generation of designer drugs. It was approved by Novartis in 2001. At the time, it was Ciba-Geigy that ultimately merged with Novartis. And the drug actually targeted the specific biological mechanism of chronic myelogenous leukemia. And based upon that mechanism, they used computer searches to come up with, after searching through hundreds of thousands of chemical compounds, the one compound, imatinib, that ultimately interfered with that leukemia process. So it was the first drug ever developed based on the underlying biology of the disease. And it was using that disruptive technology back in 2001. 2001 was before we actually sequenced the human genome. That wasn't done until 2003. So, but the question you asked is, how does CalPERS take advantage of this or go after these type of therapies? And the answer is, unless you're able to know where these breakthroughs are going to occur, it's actually very difficult unless you have scale. So getting back to imatinib, does anybody know where imatinib was actually developed? Was it at Harvard or MIT? Stanford? No? Yeah, Brian Drucker, and it was, and you know where he was when he developed this? The Oregon Health Sciences University. How many people here have heard of the Oregon Health Sciences University? I hadn't until I read the story. The point of this is that there are brilliant scientists everywhere, not just at Harvard, MIT, or Stanford, or Pitt, or Berkeley. And so in order for you to be able to benefit from this trend, what you need to do is to do what Jack Bogle tells us we ought to do, which is diversify across a large number of these multiple shots on goal. The problem is in biomedicine, you can't do that unless you have scale. The typical biotech VC does not have scale, so they need to compensate for that by having a lot of alpha, a lot of acumen in picking the projects. But nobody in this world has enough acumen to be able to pick all of the Brian Druckers or the Eric Landers or Bob Langers of the world. And so my proposal is create a large portfolio of biomedical investments, only of the size that a CalPERS or similar sized funds could actually do. And this would greatly speed innovation in this space and give a good return to investors.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Yee.
Thank you, Henry. I really appreciate this panel, and it's a very provocative panel as we embark on looking at the potential for investing in late-stage healthcare ventures, potentially. My question is really to each of you who have spoken about the importance of policy. And it's about really having our eyes open with respect to where we decide to place capital, and is there a role for investors to play with respect to shaping some of this policy? Because it seems to me we have to be certainly trying to minimize our risk when we do place our capital. At the same time, I think you're looking for more voices with respect to some of the policy changes that need to be made. So do you see a synergy there, and what can we be doing?
So first, I'll say that there is policy associated with every investment that we make because it's in healthcare. And so we look very carefully at really all of the different policy dimensions, the risks. We look from a compliance perspective as to whether the companies we are investing in are strong in compliance with the law. We look at what we think is going to happen in policy over the period that we're going to hold the asset, and all of these are very important determinations as to whether or not the firm invests or not in a given asset. So that's not exactly the question that you asked, but I wanted to kind of start there.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let's say we have a focus on this whole phenomenon of how we're under deploying technology.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the hurdles that we have to get through, or how do we prioritize, I guess, the policy hurdles in terms of being able to?
The policy will move at the pace that the policy moves, and in some ways, much as we would love to speed certain things up or slow certain things down, it is kind of exogenous. It's not there are people in Washington who lobby on these things and who kind of engage, and our role, is to make a good investment on your behalf. And so, we're really, I think, more concerned about anticipating what is going to happen than trying to create some ideal state that one might want to happen. That's kind of not our job in the investment area. I would say, though, that it is very frequent that the policymakers will call on us because we know things, and we're very happy to tell them what we know, and we do that all the time. At Welsh, it's myself and Tom Scully, who's been a partner at Welsh for about 15 years, and there's a lot of discussion because we're happy to share what we know with policymakers to help them understand kind of where things are. And the organization that was referenced before, this kind of health policy group, is kind of one of the places in which we will participate to make sure that what we know is also known in the public domain.
So can I just add to that? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Please. I just wanted to talk about policy specifically with regard to healthcare. One of the things that I find frustrating, not being a policy expert at all, is that ultimately policy is going to be driven by legislative agendas, and legislative agendas are driven by constituents and what they're looking to see. So I think that one way to put pressure on policymakers is not to argue with them, but rather to get the constituents to really move en masse to say, we want this to happen. And I think that ultimately policy in healthcare is going to move when there's enough force, enough pressure to build up, when push comes to shove. And so my view is that when we start developing lots and lots of new therapies that are costing $2 million each, and we realize that we can't possibly afford this, it can't keep going on, at that point, policymakers will be forced to take these issues head on. And by the way, not to say that they aren't doing it now. For example, Representative Juan Vargas from San Diego, he's actually sponsored a bill last year that we were involved in discussing with him regarding rare diseases, a public-private partnership that would allow investors, private sector investors, to partner with NIH to be able to develop some of these therapies, and to allow NIH and the government and taxpayers to recoup some of the benefits of the investments. That hasn't come to the floor yet. The hope is that it'll come to the floor sometime later this year, early next year. But that's an example of how policy is actually moving in response to these kinds of innovations.
Yeah, my response here is very simple in how we view policy. It's the same way we view our investments. Is we segment healthcare into three primary buckets. It's patients, providers, and payers. And if you find investments or policies that are beneficial and provide a beneficial ROI to all three of those buckets, those are great investments to make. If you find that you look at companies or policies that go off the rails in one of those buckets, stay away. And that's guided us over 30 years of investment, just to say, you know, it's investing for dummies. Is this doing the right thing by those constituencies? And that's how we look at every transaction, every investment that comes into Summit every day. It's in that light first, and then we dig down into the details.
Okay, I think that concludes the questions, and I want to thank Ms. Kaur, Mr. Lowe, Mr. Francis, and Mr. Middleton for your perspectives on this important topic because it is so important to our investment strategies. And Mr. Lowe, I want to thank you for explaining how the $2.1 million would be paid for, because I was wondering how I was going to transfer this asset when I passed away, this mortgage. So thank you for that. Okay, so now we're going to